This is the story of a city that once ruled the known world. A city of marble and might, of emperors and legions, of law and language. But even the eternal city was not immune to time. This is the story of how Rome fell, not in a single day, but in slow, grinding collapse. But before we begin tonight's journey, if you enjoy these calm and immersive history narrations to fall asleep to, consider subscribing. And also tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? We love seeing how far our history travels. Now, let's begin. There were still senators, still togas, still fountains. But the rot was already in the bones. The year was 410 AD. Rome, once the unchallenged heart of an empire that stretched from the windswept moors of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, was now a city haunted by its own grandeur. The marble columns still stood, but the voices that once echoed beneath them, Cicero's oratory, Caesar's commands, were long gone. The Senate still met, but its decrees carried little weight beyond the city walls. The aqueducts still flowed, but the grain ships from Africa were fewer, the markets thinner, the people hungrier. The legions that once marched in perfect formation across continents were now scattered, underpaid, and often more loyal to their generals than to the emperor. The emperors themselves came and went with dizzying speed, some murdered, others deposed, many forgotten. The imperial court had long since moved to Ravenna, a marshy refuge far from the grandeur of the Forum, leaving Rome a ceremonial husk. And yet, the city still believed in its own myth. It still called itself the Caput Mundi, the head of the world. But the world had changed. Germanic tribes pressed at the borders. The economy faltered under the weight of inflation and corruption. Christianity, once persecuted, now sat at the heart of imperial power, reshaping Rome's identity from within. The gods of Jupiter and Mars had been cast aside, their temples abandoned or repurposed. The old ways were dying, and with them, the confidence that Rome was eternal. The people sensed it. The senators whispered it. The generals feared it. And beyond the Alps, a man named Alaric watched it. He saw not a city of gods, but a city ripe for reckoning. Rome, once the greatest power, now flickering like a candle in the wind. The grandeur remained, but it was hollow. The marble temples still gleamed in the sun, but their gods had fallen silent. The Colosseum still stood, but the games were fewer, the crowds thinner, the cheers muted. The Roman eagle still adorned standards, but the legions beneath them were no longer the iron phalanx of Caesar's day. They were mercenaries, foederati, men who spoke Gothic or Frankish more fluently than Latin. The empire's borders, once guarded by stone walls and steel discipline, had become porous. The Rhine and Danube, once lines of fire and order, now flowed past abandoned forts and crumbling watchtowers. The treasury was empty. The grain fleets from Africa were unreliable. The roads, once the envy of the world, were cracked and overgrown in places. Even the language of power had shifted. Greek in the east, Latin in the west, but increasingly fractured, regional, diluted. The emperors, once gods in bronze and marble, now ruled in fear, often from behind palace walls in Ravenna, far from the Senate House and the Forum. They were puppets of generals, or generals themselves, elevated by troops and assassinated by rivals. The people of Rome still believed in the myth of their city's eternity, but the myth was fraying. The eternal city had become a relic, respected, yes, but no longer feared. And beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, beyond the reach of imperial law, the world was stirring. Tribes that had once trembled at the name of Rome now saw opportunity in its weakness. They watched, they waited, and they whispered warnings from the edges of the empire. They came not as proclamations, but as rumors, fragments of fear carried by merchants, soldiers and refugees. In the markets of Gaul, in the taverns of Hispania, in the crumbling forts along the Danube, voices lowered when they spoke of the Goths, of the Vandals, of the Huns. These were not the barbarians of old, scattered and disorganized. These were nations on the move, entire peoples, driven by hunger, pressure from the east, and the promise of Roman wealth. They came with wagons, with children, with warriors hardened by years of survival beyond the limes. And they came not to raid, but to settle, to claim, to conquer. Roman generals stationed in the provinces sent dispatches to the capital, warning of breaches, of alliances forming beyond the frontier, of Roman towns sacked and legions routed. But the court in Ravenna was slow to act. Bureaucracy dulled urgency. Politics clouded judgment. Some officials dismissed the reports as exaggerations. Others saw opportunity, new allies to be bought, new lands to be traded for peace. Treaties were signed. Gold was paid. Titles were granted. And still, the tribes came. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had once served Rome. He had marched under Roman banners, fought Roman wars, but he had also been betrayed. Promised land and denied it, promised gold and shortchanged. His loyalty had limits. And now, he moved south, toward Italy, not as a servant of the empire, but as its reckoner. The warnings had been whispered for years. Now they were shouted in fire and steel. And still, within the walls of Rome, the fountains flowed, the senators debated, and the banquets continued. The world is perishing, yet we dine. Saint Jerome. The words were written in a time of unraveling, when the Roman world, once so sure of its permanence, was beginning to sense the tremors beneath its marble foundations. Jerome, a scholar and priest living in Bethlehem, had once walked the streets of Rome. He had seen its splendor, its decadence, its contradictions. And now, from afar, he watched it decay. His words were not just a lament, they were an indictment. While the frontiers burned and the provinces fell, the elite of Rome still reclined on couches, still sipped wine from silver goblets, still debated poetry and lineage, as if the world beyond the city's walls had not changed. But it had. The empire was no longer the unshakable force it had once been. The barbarians were not just at the gates. They were inside them, in the armies, in the courts, in the very bloodstream of the state. And yet, the illusion of control persisted. The rituals continued. The senators still wore their purple, trimmed togas. The baths still steamed. The villas still echoed with laughter. But beneath the surface, the cracks widened, the economy faltered, the roads grew dangerous, the grain shipments dwindled, and still they dined. Still, they toasted to Rome's eternity, even as the shadows lengthened. Jerome's words captured the surreal dissonance of a civilization in denial, of a people who could not yet see that the age of empire was ending, not with a cataclysm, but with a long, slow exhale. It was a civilization carved in stone and written in law. At its height, Rome was not merely a city, it was the world. From the misty highlands of Caledonia to the sun-drenched deserts of Arabia, from the vineyards of Gaul to the bustling ports of Alexandria, the Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, binding together a mosaic of cultures, languages, and landscapes under a single banner. Its roads, straight, enduring, and meticulously engineered, stitched the empire together like veins through a living body. Its aqueducts, marvels of gravity and stone, carried fresh water across valleys and hills, feeding fountains, baths, and homes with a constancy that rivaled nature itself. The Aqua Claudia, the Pont du Gard, the Aqua Appia. These were not just feats of engineering. They were declarations of dominion over the elements. In the cities, marble gleamed under Mediterranean suns. Temples soared with fluted columns and gilded pediments. Theatres echoed with the voices of playwrights and philosophers. The law, codified, debated, and inscribed, offered a framework of order that would outlive the empire itself. Roman jurisprudence became the backbone of Western legal tradition, its principles echoing in courtrooms centuries later. Latin, the language of Cicero and Virgil, flowed through the empire's administration, its poetry, its prayers. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, held for generations, allowing trade, culture, and ideas to flourish. Citizens, whether born in Iberia or Syria, could walk the same roads, appeal to the same laws, and dream the same imperial dreams. It was a world of order, of grandeur, of ambition realized in stone and statute. But beneath the marble and majesty, the foundations were beginning to shift. The empire had grown vast, too vast, its borders stretched thin, its armies overburdened. The wealth of conquest had pooled in the hands of the few, while the many toiled or idled in dependence. The Senate, once the crucible of republican virtue, had become a theatre of vanity and intrigue. Corruption seeped into the provinces. Governors enriched themselves. Justice bent to influence. The grain dole fed the stomachs of idle citizens, but not their spirits. The empire still glittered, but the light was beginning to flicker. The empire's brilliance masked a slow decay. Beneath the marble facades and imperial decrees, Rome was rotting from within. Corruption had become a currency of its own. Governors extorted provinces, tax collectors skimmed from the top, and justice bent to the weight of gold. The Senate, once the moral compass of the Republic, had long since become a stage for vanity and self-interest. Bribes flowed more freely than laws. The bureaucracy ballooned, inefficient and bloated, while the imperial court in Ravenna grew increasingly detached from the realities of the provinces. The empire's vastness, once a symbol of its might, had become a burden. Defending the frontiers drained the treasury. Supplying distant legions strained logistics. Communication lagged. Rebellions flared. And still, the empire expanded, chasing glory it could no longer afford. The wealth of conquest, once shared through public works and grain doles, now pooled in the hands of a shrinking elite. The gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm. In the cities, the poor grew dependent on state handouts, while the rich withdrew into opulent villas, insulated from the chaos beyond their walls. The middle class, traders, artisans, smallholders, eroded under the weight of taxes and inflation. In the countryside, once free farmers became coloni, bound to the land in arrangements that resembled serfdom. The civic spirit that had once animated Rome, the pride of citizenship, the duty of service, faded into apathy. The people no longer believed in the empire. They endured it. And as the social fabric frayed, the center could no longer hold. Power became a prize, not a responsibility. Ambitious generals, backed by restless legions, marched on Rome not to defend it, but to claim it. The purple robe of the emperor changed hands with dizzying speed, sometimes through battle, sometimes through assassination, often through betrayal. The 3rd century was not an age of emperors. It was an age of usurpers, of generals crowned by legions, of rulers whose reigns were measured in months. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire endured what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the imperial purple passed from hand to hand like a cursed relic. 26 emperors rose and fell in just 5 decades, and that number does not include the countless pretenders, co-emperors, and regional warlords who claimed the title in fractured corners of the empire. Some were assassinated by their own guards. Others died in battle. A few were captured and executed by foreign enemies. Only one died of natural causes. A throne had become a death sentence. The army, once the backbone of Roman stability, had become its kingmaker and executioner. Loyalty was bought with coin and promises, and when the coin ran out, as it often did, so did the loyalty. The empire fractured. In 260 AD, the western provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia broke away to form the Gallic Empire. In the east, Palmyra rose under Queen Zenobia, carving out its own dominion. Rome itself was no longer the center of power. It was a symbol, increasingly irrelevant to the real struggles for control. The economy spiraled into inflation. Coins were debased. Trade routes became perilous. And as if political chaos were not enough, nature struck with a vengeance. Disease swept through the empire, not once, but twice, in waves of death that spared no class, no province, no army. The Antonine Plague struck first. It arrived in 165 AD, carried westward by Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the east, likely from the Parthian front. The disease, possibly smallpox, swept through the empire with terrifying speed. It did not discriminate. Soldiers, senators, slaves, none were spared. The physician Galen, who witnessed the outbreak firsthand, described its symptoms in grim detail: fever, diarrhea, skin eruptions, and a mortality rate that emptied entire towns. For 15 years, the Antonine Plague ravaged the Roman world, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people, including Emperor Lucius Verus and, eventually, Marcus Aurelius himself. The legions were decimated. The economy faltered. The empire's borders, already strained, grew vulnerable. And just as the memory of that devastation began to fade, another plague arrived. The Cyprian plague began around 249 AD and lingered for 2 decades. Named after Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, who chronicled its horrors, this new pestilence was even more mysterious. It may have been a viral hemorrhagic fever, something akin to Ebola, or perhaps a virulent strain of measles or smallpox. Whatever it was, it struck with merciless efficiency. Cyprian wrote of people vomiting, bleeding from the eyes, losing limbs to gangrene. At its height, thousands died each day in Rome alone. Cities emptied. Armies withered. The imperial court, already unstable, teetered on collapse. The plague did not just kill. It unstitched the fabric of Roman society. Labor shortages crippled agriculture. Trade routes fell silent. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Pagan priests fled their temples. Families abandoned their sick. And in the chaos, Christianity, offering care, community, and meaning, began to grow. The empire, already weakened by political chaos and military overreach, now faced an invisible enemy it could not conquer. The plagues did not just take lives, they took confidence, order, and hope. And as the dead piled up, the empire's great cities began to change. The temples stood silent. The streets, once filled with merchants and magistrates, grew still. And the cemeteries, those solemn places of rest, could no longer contain the tide of death. The heart of Rome no longer beat with the same rhythm. Once, the temples had been alive with incense and prayer, with priests chanting to Jupiter, to Mars, to Venus. Now, their altars stood cold. The statues of the gods, once polished and adorned, gathered dust. Sacrifices ceased. The augurs no longer read omens in the entrails of birds. The rituals that had bound the city to its divine protectors faded into memory. The streets, once crowded with merchants, magistrates, and citizens in flowing togas, had grown still. The laughter of children, the clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, all had quieted. Disease had emptied the forums. Fear had emptied the baths. The plagues had not only taken lives, they had taken the will to live. Funeral pyres burned day and night. Graves were dug hastily, often reused. In some quarters, the dead outnumbered the living. The stench of decay hung in the air, and with it came a deeper rot despair. The old gods had not protected them. The emperors had not saved them. The empire, once the guarantor of order and prosperity, now seemed powerless against invisible enemies. People turned inward. Some clung to new faiths, others to old superstitions. But many simply stopped believing in anything. The marble grandeur of Rome remained, but the spirit that had animated it for centuries was fading. Rome's own generals began fighting each other for the throne. It was not the barbarians who first broke the empire. It was the Romans themselves. As the 3rd century dawned, the imperial purple became less a symbol of divine authority and more a prize to be seized by force. The legions, once the disciplined arm of the state, had become kingmakers. Loyalty no longer flowed to the Senate or the emperor, but to the general who paid best, who promised land, who inspired fear or hope. The result was chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire saw no fewer than 26 emperors officially recognized by the Senate, and dozens more who claimed the title in rebellion. Some ruled for years, others for weeks. Most died violently. The sword, not the law, determined succession. The cycle was brutal. A general would be proclaimed emperor by his troops, often on the battlefield, sometimes in the provinces. He would march on Rome or Ravenna, defeat the sitting emperor, and take the throne. But his legitimacy was always fragile. Another general, in another province, would rise in turn. The empire became a chessboard of shifting allegiances and sudden betrayals. Civil wars erupted not at the fringes, but at the heart of Roman power. Provinces were stripped of garrisons, as rival claimants pulled troops to their cause. Cities were sacked by Roman hands. Infrastructure was neglected. The frontiers, once guarded by proud legions, were left exposed. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west, Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia declaring loyalty to their own emperors. In the east, Palmyra rose under Queen Zenobia, carving out a realm that rivaled Rome in wealth and ambition. The Central Empire, centered in Italy, was squeezed between these breakaway states, its authority mocked by its own fragmentation. Even when a strong emperor emerged, like Aurelian, who reconquered the lost provinces and briefly restored unity, his reign was short-lived. He was assassinated by his own officers before he could consolidate power. The empire had become a revolving door of ambition and bloodshed. The cost was staggering. The economy collapsed under the weight of constant warfare. Coinage was debased to pay troops, leading to runaway inflation. Trade routes became perilous. Cities shrank. Farmlands were abandoned. The population declined not just from war, but from famine, plague, and despair. The Roman people, once proud citizens of a mighty republic, turned empire, now lived under the rule of warlords in imperial clothing. The idea of Rome, of law, of order, of civilization, was fading. And yet, the empire endured. Not because of strength, but because of inertia. Because the machinery of administration, though battered, still functioned. Because the roads still connected cities. Because the memory of Rome's greatness still lingered in the minds of its people. But it was a hollow endurance. The emperors no longer ruled from Rome. The Senate was a ceremonial relic. The legions were no longer Roman in blood or spirit. And as the empire's own sons tore it apart, it turned increasingly to outsiders to hold it together. Mercenaries and barbarian auxiliaries paid to keep peace. As Rome's own legions grew unreliable, fractured by civil war, depleted by plague, and disillusioned by politics, the empire turned increasingly to outsiders to defend its borders and suppress unrest. These were not Roman citizens, nor even Romanized provincials. They were Goths, Franks, Vandals, Alans. Peoples who had once been enemies, now hired as protectors. Some were settled within the empire's frontiers as foederati, granted land in exchange for military service. Others were paid in gold, titles, and promises. They filled the ranks of depleted legions, guarded frontier towns, and marched under Roman banners. But they were not Roman in heart or heritage. Their loyalty was transactional, their allegiance fragile. They fought for coin, not country. And when the coin ran dry, as it often did in the crumbling economy of the late empire, their swords turned inward. Some rebelled. Others demanded more land, more power, more autonomy. The empire, desperate and hollowed, conceded again and again. Generals like Stilicho and Ricimer, themselves of barbarian descent, rose to power not just as commanders, but as kingmakers, wielding influence behind the throne, often more powerful than the emperors they served. The line between Roman and barbarian blurred. The legions became patchworks of languages, customs, and loyalties. Discipline. Once the pride of the Roman military machine began to erode. The old drills, the iron discipline of the centuria, the unbreakable formations of the testudo, these faded into memory. The auxiliaries fought well when led and paid, but they were not bound by the same traditions, the same oaths, the same sense of Romanitas. And as the empire leaned more heavily on these foreign arms, it lost control of its own. The army no longer served the state. It served itself, or whoever could command its loyalty for a time. The legions that had once conquered the world now struggled to hold it together. The chain of command frayed. Orders were ignored. Officers were replaced by opportunists. And in the chaos, the very idea of Rome, its discipline, its unity, its identity, began to dissolve. The Roman army, once the most formidable force the world had ever known, had become a shadow of itself. The iron discipline that had marched legions across continents, that had crushed Carthage, that had held the line at the Rhine and the Euphrates, was gone. In its place stood a patchwork of mercenaries, conscripts, and foreign auxiliaries, men who wore Roman armor but did not speak Latin, who fought not for Rome, but for gold, for land, or for survival. The chain of command had frayed beyond repair. Officers were appointed not for merit, but for favor. Orders were ignored, or worse, sold to the highest bidder. The once proud legions no longer trained with rigor, no longer drilled with precision. Cohesion dissolved. Morale plummeted. Veterans retired or deserted. Recruits were poorly equipped, poorly led, and poorly motivated. The empire's enemies knew it. They could see it in the way Roman patrols hesitated at the frontier, in the way garrisons failed to respond to raids, in the way Roman commanders bickered among themselves while villages burned. The loyalty that had once bound soldier to general, citizen to emperor, had withered. The idea of Rome, of shared destiny, of civic pride, of imperial unity, no longer inspired. It no longer commanded sacrifice. And as the empire's internal strength crumbled, the world beyond its borders stirred. The Rhine and Danube, once lines of fire and stone, now seemed more like invitations than barriers. Across those rivers, in the forests and steppes, the great migrations had begun. Driven by hunger, by pressure from the east, by the lure of Roman wealth and weakness, new forces gathered. Visigoths, Vandals, Huns begin probing the empire's borders. They came first as shadows. Distant rumors of movement beyond the rivers, of strange banners rising in the forests, of peoples on the move. The Visigoths, once allies and mercenaries of Rome, had been displaced by a new terror from the east, the Huns. Fierce, fast, and utterly alien to Roman eyes, the Huns swept across the steppes of Central Asia and into Europe like a storm. Their arrival sent shockwaves through the Germanic world, pushing entire tribes westward in search of safety. The Visigoths, desperate and hungry, begged the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for asylum. He granted it, then failed to feed them. Starvation turned to rebellion. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths annihilated a Roman army and killed the emperor himself. It was a wound the empire would never fully heal. The Vandals, too, were on the move. Pressed by the Huns and drawn by the weakness of Rome, they crossed the frozen Rhine in 406, sweeping into Gaul, then Spain, and finally into North Africa. There, they seized Carthage, Rome's ancient rival and vital breadbasket. With it, they took control of the grain supply and the western Mediterranean. The Vandals were no longer wanderers. They were kings. And the Huns, they hovered like a spectre. Under Attila, they became more than raiders. They became an empire of fear. They extorted tribute from Constantinople, threatened both eastern and western courts, and ravaged the Balkans. Their riders moved with terrifying speed, their tactics unlike anything Rome had faced. They did not seek to conquer and govern. They sought to plunder, to punish, to dominate. Rome watched all this unfold with a mixture of arrogance and disbelief. These were barbarians, after all, uncivilized, unworthy, unthreatening. The empire had faced such threats before and endured. So it dismissed the warnings. It mocked the messengers. It believed in its own myth, until it didn't. Because when the legions failed to hold the line, when the cities fell, when the gold ran out, Rome did what it had once sworn never to do. At first, the empire scoffed. The Visigoths were seen as little more than unruly clients, the Vandals as a nuisance, the Huns as a distant terror best, left to the east. Rome had faced barbarians before and triumphed. It had crushed Gauls, humbled Parthians, and absorbed countless tribes into its orbit. So when emissaries from these migrating peoples came to negotiate, to plead for land or protection, they were often met with disdain. Roman officials, clinging to the illusion of supremacy, dismissed their requests, delayed their answers, or demanded humiliating concessions. The empire still believed it could dictate terms. But the world had changed. The barbarians were no longer scattered raiders. They were organized, mobile, and increasingly desperate, and desperation breeds resolve. When the Visigoths crossed the Danube in 376, they did so not as invaders, but as refugees, fleeing the Huns and seeking asylum within Roman borders. They were granted entry, but then starved, extorted, and abused by corrupt Roman officials. Their patience broke. What followed was rebellion, and then the catastrophic defeat of Roman forces at Adrianople. The empire had dismissed them, and paid the price. After that, Rome's posture shifted. It began to see these tribes not just as threats, but as potential partners. The legions were depleted, the treasury was strained, the frontiers were porous. Rome needed soldiers, and the barbarians had them. So the empire began to make deals. Treaties were signed, land was ceded, titles were granted. The Visigoths were settled in the Balkans as foederati, allies bound by oath but not by citizenship. The Vandals were placated with gold and promises. Even the Huns under Attila were paid tribute, vast sums of gold to keep their wrath at bay. Rome, once the master of the Mediterranean, now found itself negotiating from a position of weakness. It offered what it once would have taken. It pleaded where it once commanded. The empire that had once absorbed the world now bartered with it, hoping to buy time, to buy peace, to buy survival. By the early 5th century, Rome was no longer the master of its fate. It was a supplicant, bargaining with the very peoples it had once conquered. The empire's strength had become a memory, its legions diluted, its coffers drained. In this vacuum of power, diplomacy became desperation. The Visigoths, once enemies, were now courted as allies. The Vandals, who had seized North Africa and Rome's grain supply, were offered treaties and recognition. Even the Huns, feared across Europe for their ferocity, were paid tribute in gold and promises. Rome, which had once dictated the terms of peace, now begged for it. Emperors and generals offered land, titles, and bribes to keep the barbarians at bay. They called it foedus, a treaty of mutual obligation. But it was clear who held the leverage. These were not alliances forged in strength, but in fear. The empire had become a patchwork of uneasy truces and fragile arrangements, each one a gamble that the next crisis could be delayed. But the barbarians were no longer content with tribute. They had seen the weakness at the heart of the empire. They had marched through its provinces, seen its cities hollowed by plague and neglect, its armies fractured by infighting. They no longer wanted gold. They wanted land, security. And when those promises were broken, as they so often were, they turned to force. Among them was a man who had once fought for Rome, who had worn its armor and led its troops. But now, he led his people not as a servant of the empire, but as its reckoner. Visigoth King Alaric marches on Rome, not for glory, but survival. He had once fought for the empire, worn its armor, obeyed its commands. But Rome had betrayed him, again and again. Promises of land, of titles, of peace had been made and broken. His people, the Visigoths, had bled for Rome at Frigidus, had served as foederati, had waited patiently for the rewards they were owed. But the empire, fractured and arrogant, saw them as tools, not allies. Alaric had no illusions left. He did not march on Rome to conquer it in the name of Gothic supremacy. He marched because his people were starving, because the empire had failed them, because survival demanded it. In 408, Alaric led his army into Italy. The road to Rome lay open. The imperial court had long since abandoned the city for the marshes of Ravenna, leaving the ancient capital exposed. Alaric did not sack it immediately. He laid siege, hoping to force negotiation. He demanded gold, grain, and recognition. The Senate, powerless and panicked, agreed to pay. Rome, once the mistress of the world, now ransomed her own life. But the payments were not enough. The negotiations collapsed. Alaric returned. Again he surrounded the city. Again he demanded justice. Again he was denied. In 410, after years of frustration, betrayal and hunger, Alaric gave the order. His men entered through the Salarian gate, opened, some say, by slaves within. For 3 days, the Visigoths moved through the eternal city. They looted, yes, but selectively. Churches were spared. Bloodshed was limited. This was not a massacre. It was a reckoning. A city that had not been taken by foreign arms in 800 years now lay at the mercy of those it had once scorned. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves across the known world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, wept. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. But what Alaric found was not the Rome of legend. It was a city already hollowed by time. The legions were gone. The walls were crumbling. The people were broken. There was no emperor to defend it, no gods to protect it, no spirit to rally. The sack was not the cause of Rome's fall. It was its symptom. A final, brutal punctuation to a long sentence of decline. The eternal city had never felt so mortal. Its walls, once symbols of strength, now stood more as relics than fortifications. The legions that had once marched in triumph through its gates were gone, scattered across distant provinces, disbanded or dead. The emperors no longer ruled from its palaces. The Senate, once the heartbeat of Roman governance, had become a ceremonial echo chamber. issuing decrees no one obeyed. The people, once proud citizens of the empire, now lived in fear and uncertainty, their faith in Rome's invincibility shattered. The aqueducts still carried water, the temples still cast long shadows at dusk, but the soul of the city had dimmed. The gods had fallen silent, the emperors had fled. The marble grandeur remained, but it was hollow, like a stage set for a play whose actors had long since vanished. When Alaric and his Visigoths approached, there was no army to meet them, no general to negotiate, no divine sign to ward them off. The city's defenses were symbolic at best. Its spirit, once unbreakable, had been worn down by decades of betrayal, famine, plague, and fear. The citizens waited, not with defiance, but with resignation. They had seen the omens. They had heard the rumors. They knew what was coming, and when the moment arrived, it was not with a thunderous assault, but with a whisper. A gate opened, perhaps by treachery, perhaps by desperation, and with it, the final illusion of Rome's security crumbled. It was not a siege in the traditional sense. No battering rams, no catapults, no drawn-out starvation. Rome, once the most fortified and feared city in the world, was taken not by force of arms, but by the weight of its own decay. The Salarian Gate, whether opened by treachery or desperation, swung wide in the dead of night, and through it poured the Visigoths, disciplined, determined, and grim. They did not come with the wild fury of myth. They came with purpose. For 3 days, they moved through the city's streets, not as mindless marauders, but as men who had waited too long for justice. They took what had been denied them: gold, grain, dignity. The palaces were stripped of their treasures. The homes of the elite were ransacked. Statues were toppled. The symbols of Roman pride were reduced to spoils. But it was not wanton destruction. Alaric had given orders churches were to be spared, the lives of the innocent protected, and for the most part those orders were followed. This was not a massacre. It was a reckoning. The looting was methodical, almost restrained. The Visigoths were not there to burn Rome to the ground. They were there to remind it that its time had passed. The citizens, stunned and silent, watched as the myth of their city crumbled before their eyes. The eternal city had been breached, not by a superior army, but by the consequences of its own arrogance, its own betrayals, its own decline. And as the Visigoths moved through the marble streets, past the broken columns and shattered illusions, one truth became clear. They came not as conquerors, but as men who had run out of patience. Alaric's Visigoths did not storm into Rome with the triumphal arrogance of Caesar or the imperial pomp of Augustus. They entered as men who had been pushed, slighted, and ignored. Men who had once fought for the empire, who had bled for its causes, and who had been repaid with broken promises and empty gestures. Their march was not one of conquest, but of reckoning. They did not seek to destroy Rome for glory or vengeance. They sought what they had been denied: security, dignity, a future. And when the gates opened, they took it. The looting was not indiscriminate. It was measured, almost restrained. Churches were largely spared. The great basilicas became sanctuaries. The sack was not a firestorm, it was a funeral procession. Rome, the city of 7 hills, the heart of an empire that had once ruled the known world, now lay open not to a foreign invader, but to the consequences of its own decline. The Visigoths did not raze it to the ground. They did not need to. The symbolic blow was enough. The world watched in stunned silence. For centuries, Rome had been the unassailable center of civilization, the city that had taken the world and bent it to its will. Its walls had withstood Hannibal, its legions had marched unchallenged. And now, it had fallen, not to a mighty army, but to the slow erosion of its own strength, its own unity, its own soul. Rome hadn't been sacked in 800 years. Not since the Gauls breached its walls in 390 BC had the eternal city fallen to a foreign enemy. For centuries, that memory had been buried beneath layers of triumph, of legions marching home in victory, of emperors crowned in marble halls, of temples rising to the heavens. Rome had become more than a city. It was a symbol of order, of civilization, of divine favor. Its walls were thought to be protected not just by stone and steel, but by destiny itself. And yet, in 410 AD, that illusion shattered. The sack by Alaric's Visigoths was not just a military event. It was a psychological earthquake. The unthinkable had happened. The city that had once ruled the world had been humbled. News of the sack spread like wildfire across the empire and beyond. In Bethlehem, the scholar Jerome wept, writing, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Panic gripped the provinces. Refugees poured into the countryside. The old gods, long since abandoned, were remembered in fear. And in the vacuum of explanation, people searched for meaning. How could this have happened? Why had the gods, or God, allowed it? Christians say it's punishment from God. To many in the Christian world, the sack of Rome in 410 AD was not just a political or military catastrophe. It was a divine reckoning. The city that had once persecuted Christians, that had crucified Peter and beheaded Paul, had now embraced the cross. And yet, it fell. Why? Some saw it as a test of faith. Others, more starkly, saw it as judgment. The writings of early church fathers echoed with the belief that Rome's suffering was a consequence of sin, of pride, of decadence, of moral decay. St. Augustine, in his monumental work The City of God, began writing in the aftermath of the sack, responding to the panic and despair that gripped the Christian world. He argued that no earthly city, not even Rome, was eternal. Only the city of God, spiritual, heavenly, unshakable, could offer true refuge. To Augustine and others, the fall of Rome was not the failure of Christianity, but the fulfillment of its warnings. The world was perishing. As St. Jerome had written, and the faithful were called not to cling to marble and empire, but to grace and eternity. The sack was not the end. It was a beginning, a call to repentance, a reminder that salvation lay not in walls or emperors, but in God alone. Pagans say it's because the old gods were abandoned. To those who still clung to the ancient rites, the sack of Rome was not just a tragedy, it was a divine rebuke. For centuries, the city had honored Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the pantheon of Roman deities with temples, festivals, and sacrifices. These gods, they believed, had watched over Rome since its founding, had guided its armies, and had blessed its emperors. But now, their temples stood silent. Their altars were cold. Statues of Jupiter, Capitolinus, and Minerva had been left to gather dust, while crosses rose in their place. The old rituals had been outlawed or forgotten. The Vestal Virgins, once the sacred guardians of Rome's eternal flame, had been disbanded. To the pagans, this abandonment was not progress, it was sacrilege. And the sack of 410 AD was proof. They saw it as the gods turning their backs on a city that had turned its back on them. The Christians could speak of divine tests and heavenly cities, but the pagans saw only the ruins of the one that mattered. They whispered that the gods had withdrawn their favor, that the divine shield, which had protected Rome for centuries, had been shattered by neglect. The debate raged in the streets, in the forums, in the letters of philosophers and bishops. Was this the wrath of the old gods, or the judgment of the new? Was it a test of faith or a punishment for apostasy? In truth, it was both and neither. It was history unfolding, complex, brutal, and indifferent to belief. But one truth pierced through all the arguments, all the sermons, all the lamentations. Everyone realizes Rome can bleed. The illusion of invincibility was gone. For centuries, Rome had been the unshakable center of the world, a city that had outlasted kings, crushed empires, and dictated the terms of civilization. But now, the unthinkable had happened. The sack of 410 AD shattered the myth. The eternal city had been breached, looted, humbled. And with that breach came a shift in the collective consciousness of the Roman world. No longer was Rome the untouchable heart of empire. It was vulnerable, mortal. The psychological blow rippled far beyond the city's walls. In distant provinces, governors and generals began to question the empire's permanence. In foreign courts, kings and chieftains saw opportunity where once they had seen only awe. The idea of Rome, eternal, divine, ordained, had cracked. And in that crack, fear took root. If Rome could fall, what else could? If the center could not hold, what hope was there for the edges? The sack was not just a military event. It was a revelation. It exposed the fragility beneath the marble, the rot beneath the ritual. And as the dust settled, the world looked upon Rome not with reverence, but with recognition. It could bleed, it could fall. It had. They were the ones history rarely names, the poor, the slaves, the abandoned. When the Visigoths entered Rome, it was not the senators or generals who bore the brunt of the chaos. It was the washerwoman whose husband had died in the fields of Illyricum, the street vendor who once sold olives near the Forum, now hiding in the shadows of broken columns, the child born into servitude who had never known a day of freedom, now watching his master's villa burn. These were the people who had no voice in the Senate, no refuge in Ravenna, no gold to ransom their safety. They lived in the insulae, crowded, crumbling apartment blocks where fire spread faster than news. They fetched water from public fountains, now dry or fouled. They relied on the grain dole, now interrupted by war and theft. When the gates opened, they did not flee. They had nowhere to go. Some begged the invaders for mercy. Others scavenged behind them, hoping to find scraps of food or clothing. Slaves were abandoned by fleeing masters, left to fend for themselves in a city that no longer had order or law. Some were freed by the chaos. Others were taken by new hands. The poor huddled in churches, clutching icons and prayers, hoping the sanctity of stone would shield them. But even the sacred could not stop hunger. The markets were stripped bare, the granaries looted, the bakeries silent. The great Roman baths, once humming with conversation and steam, now echoed only with dripping water and distant cries. The marble floors were cold. The fires had gone out. The silence was not peace. It was absence. Absence of order, of comfort, of Rome as it had been. Homes ransacked. Food gone. Silence in the baths and markets. The city that once pulsed with the rhythm of empire now lay still. The Visigoths had taken what they needed, what they believed they were owed, and left behind a city stripped of illusion. In the wealthier districts, villas stood gutted, their mosaics shattered, their silver gone. In the poorer quarters, what little had existed was now ash or rubble. The granaries were emptied, the bakeries cold. The scent of fresh bread, once a daily comfort, had vanished. The markets, once a cacophony of barter and laughter, now echoed with the sound of wind through broken stalls. The great Roman baths, those marvels of engineering and leisure, were silent. No steam rose from their pools. No philosophers debated in the caldarium. The marble floors were slick with dust, not water. The fountains, once fed by aqueducts that spanned valleys and mountains, now trickled or stood dry. The city's heartbeat had slowed to a whisper. and in that hush, the powerful began to vanish. The senators, once cloaked in purple and pride, slipped away in the night. Some to Ravenna, others to distant estates, hoping to wait out the storm. Their homes, once adorned with busts of ancestors and gods, were left to looters and decay. Statues that had stood for centuries, of emperors, of generals, of gods, toppled from their pedestals, not always by force, but by neglect. The marble cracked, the bronze tarnished. The symbols of Rome's eternity crumbled, one by one. Senators flee, statues crumble. The men who once shaped the fate of the known world, who debated laws beneath coffered ceilings, and dined beneath frescoes of conquest, now vanished like smoke. Some escaped to Ravenna, others to distant estates in Campania or Sicily, hoping to wait out the storm behind high walls and hired guards. Their marble homes in Rome, once adorned with busts of ancestors and gods, stood hollow. The atriums echoed with silence. The mosaics cracked under the boots of looters. The libraries, filled with scrolls of Cicero and Livy, were scattered, burned, or forgotten. In the public squares, statues that had stood for centuries, bronze Caesars, marble gods, generals cast in triumph, toppled from their pedestals. Some were pulled down by invaders, others by desperate citizens seeking coin from melted metal. Still others simply fell, their foundations weakened by time and neglect. A forum, once the beating heart of Roman civic life, became a graveyard of broken stone and broken memory. The gods of old, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, watched in silence, their temples desecrated or repurposed, their names fading from the lips of a new generation. The city's grandeur remained in fragments, a column here, a frieze there, a fading mural of a triumph long past. But the spirit that had animated it, the belief in Rome's eternity, in its divine favor, in its civilizing mission, was ebbing away. The people no longer looked to the capital with reverence. They looked to it with fear, or worse, indifference. The rituals continued, but hollowed. The processions marched, but fewer watched. The Senate still met, but its words carried no weight beyond the chamber walls. The soul of the city begins to rot, not in fire, not in blood, but in silence. Rome did not collapse in a single night. It decayed slowly. From within, the rituals continued, but they were hollow. The Senate still met, but its words echoed in empty halls. The people still gathered in the forum, but not to debate or celebrate. They came to beg, to barter, to mourn. The marble facades remained, but behind them, the city's spirit withered. The fountains trickled with algae, choked water. The libraries stood locked. The laughter of children, once heard in the baths and gardens, was replaced by the shuffle of the hungry and the sick. The soul of Rome, its civic pride, its sense of destiny, its belief in itself, had faded into memory. The temples, once alive with incense and prayer, were now quiet. The gods had been replaced, but the new faith had not yet filled the void. The poor wandered the streets, eyes hollow. The rich had fled. The middle class had vanished beneath taxes and fear. The city's arteries, its roads, its aqueducts, its markets, still functioned, but barely. Rome was no longer the heart of an empire. It was a relic, revered but irrelevant. And as the center weakened, the edges began to drift. In Gaul, local warlords rose, claiming power in the name of Rome, but answering to no one. In Hispania, Roman governors became kings in all but name. In Britannia, the legions had long since departed, leaving the island to fend for itself against Saxons and Scots. North Africa, once the empire's granary, now answered to Vandal kings. Even Italy itself was no longer secure, ravaged by war, divided by ambition, ruled by emperors who were puppets of generals or pawns of foreign powers. The provinces, once bound by law and loyalty, now looked inward. Some declared independence outright. Others fell under the sway of barbarian chieftains, who styled themselves as Roman officials, issuing coins with imperial faces and speaking Latin in court, but whose allegiance was to their own blood and blade. The empire had not been conquered. It had been abandoned. By its leaders, by its people, by its own fading will. Provinces declare independence or fall to barbarian kings. As the Western Roman Empire unraveled, its provinces, once tightly bound by law, language and legion, began to drift into autonomy or fall under the sway of new rulers. The imperial center, weakened by civil war, economic collapse, and foreign invasion, could no longer project power across its vast territories. In Gaul, the Franks and Burgundians carved out their own realms, blending Roman administration with Germanic kingship. In Hispania, the Suebi Visigoths established kingdoms that mimicked Roman governance but answered to no emperor. North Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, was seized by the Vandals, who ruled from Carthage with a fleet that rivaled Rome's own. Even Italy itself, the heartland of empire, was no longer secure, torn between puppet emperors and barbarian generals who ruled in all but name. These were not mere invasions. They were transformations. The so-called barbarian kings adopted Roman titles, minted coins with imperial imagery, and governed with the help of Roman elites. They wore the cloak of empire, even as they dismantled its foundations. The Western Roman Empire did not fall with a single blow. It fragmented, piece by piece, into successor states that claimed its legacy, while forging their own paths. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople watched with wary detachment, offering recognition to some rulers, waging war on others, but never able to restore what had been lost. And then there was Britain, distant, windswept, and increasingly isolated. The island had long been a frontier outpost, valuable but expendable. As the 5th century wore on, Roman legions were recalled from Britain to defend more vital territories. Appeals for aid went unanswered. The cities, once adorned with baths and basilicas, fell into disrepair. The roads grew overgrown. The villas were abandoned. Without Roman protection, the Britons were left to face the Picts from the north, the Irish from the west, and the Saxons from across the sea. Britain abandoned. It had once been a jewel of the empire's northern frontier, a land of walled cities, Roman roads, and legions stationed at Hadrian's Wall. Londinium bustled with trade. Bath steamed with elegance. The countryside was dotted with villas, temples, and the quiet hum of Roman order. But by the early 400s, that order had vanished. The legions, overstretched and needed elsewhere, were recalled to defend Italy and Gaul. The imperial court, preoccupied with its own survival, ceased to send aid. Appeals from British towns and councils went unanswered. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius reportedly told the Britons to look to their own defences. It was not a command, it was a surrender. Without Roman protection, Britain fractured. Local warlords rose, claiming authority in the name of Rome, but answering only to themselves. The Saxons, once hired as mercenaries, began to settle and conquer. The Picts raided from the north, the Irish from the west. Roman villas fell into ruin. The great baths and basilicas crumbled. Latin faded from the lips of the people. Christianity, once nurtured under Roman rule, survived in isolated pockets. The island slipped into what would later be called the Dark Ages. Not because the people vanished, but because the light of Roman administration, architecture, and literacy dimmed. And Britain was only the beginning. Gaul, Hispania, North Africa slip away. They had once been the lifeblood of the Western Empire. Gaul with its vineyards and legions. Hispania with its silver and scholars. North Africa with its grain and gold. These provinces had been Roman for centuries, their cities echoing with Latin, their roads paved with imperial ambition. But by the 5th century, they were no longer provinces. They were prizes. In Gaul, the Franks and Burgundians carved out their own realms, seizing cities, forging alliances, and slowly replacing Roman governors with warrior kings. Roman law still lingered in the courts, Latin still echoed in the churches, but the banners flying above the walls were no longer imperial. The Visigoths, once settled as allies, now ruled as sovereigns from Toulouse, then Toledo. The Roman dream in Gaul had not ended. It had been rewritten. In Hispania, the Suebian Visigoths divided the land, their kings issuing edicts in Latin, while their warriors spoke Germanic tongues. Roman villas were repurposed as royal courts. The old senatorial families either fled or bent the knee. The imperial tax collectors stopped coming. The roads fell into disrepair. The aqueducts dried. Hispania had not rebelled. It had simply drifted away, like a ship whose moorings had rotted. And in North Africa, the Vandals struck with speed and precision. Crossing from Hispania in 429, they swept through the provinces with little resistance. By 439, they had taken Carthage, the second city of the West, the granary of Rome. From there, they launched raids across the Mediterranean, even sacking Rome itself in 455. The empire had lost more than land. It had lost its breadbasket, its fleet, its pride. These were not isolated losses. They were symptoms of a deeper unraveling. The imperial court in Ravenna issued decrees no one obeyed. The emperors changed with dizzying speed. Puppets of generals, shadows of their predecessors. The Senate in Rome still met, still debated. But its words carried no weight beyond the city walls. The empire still claimed dominion from the Atlantic to the Danube, but its reach extended little beyond Italy, and even there, the center no longer held. Rome is no longer a capital, just a symbol. The city that had once ruled the known world, that had sent legions to the edges of the earth, and laws to every province, now sat hollowed and ceremonial. The emperors no longer ruled from its palaces. The real power had long since shifted. To Milan, to Ravenna, to Constantinople. Rome remained the spiritual heart of the empire, but not its brain. It was a city of memories, not decisions. The Senate still met, but its decrees were ignored. The temples still stood, but their gods were silent. The people still walked its streets, but they no longer looked to the Palatine Hill for leadership. Rome had become a relic, revered, visited, but no longer obeyed. The emperors who once strode through its marble halls now ruled from distant courts, surrounded by generals, eunuchs, and foreign advisors. The imperial court in Ravenna, nestled in the marshes of northern Italy, was safer, more defensible, and more removed from the chaos that gripped the western provinces. Rome, once the center of the world, was now a stage set for nostalgia. Its triumphal arches commemorated victories no one remembered. Its statues honored men whose names had lost their meaning. The eternal city endured, but as a ghost of its former self. And then, in one final act of imperial theater, a child was placed upon the throne. In 475 AD, a Roman general named Orestes seized power. But instead of crowning himself, he crowned his son, a boy of perhaps 14. His name was Romulus Augustus. The irony was cruel. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome. Augustus, the name of its first and greatest emperor. But this Romulus was no founder. This Augustus was no ruler. He was a puppet, a placeholder, a symbol of a vanished world. His reign lasted less than a year. He issued no laws, led no armies, won no battles. He was a boy emperor in a crumbling empire, a final, flickering echo of Rome's grandeur. A boy emperor placed on the throne, a mockery of Rome's past. Romulus Augustulus. His very name was a cruel echo of greatness. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, Augustus, the first and most revered emperor. But this Romulus was no founder, no architect of empire. He was a child, perhaps 14, placed on the throne not by the will of the people or the Senate, but by his father, Orestes, a general who seized power and needed a pliable figurehead. The boy wore the purple, but it hung loose on his shoulders. He issued no edicts, commanded no armies, inspired no loyalty. His court was a shadow play, his authority a fiction. The empire he was meant to rule was already fractured beyond repair. Gaul was gone. Hispania lost. Africa seized. The legions were mercenaries. The treasury empty. The Senate irrelevant. And the people, those who still called themselves Roman, watched with wary eyes as the last embers of imperial dignity flickered. Outside the gates, a new power was rising. Odoacer, a commander of barbarian troops in Roman service, had grown tired of broken promises. His soldiers, Heruli Siri Rugians, demanded land in Italy as payment for their service. Orestes refused, so Odoacer marched. In 476 AD, he crushed Orestes' forces, executed him near Piacenza, and advanced on Ravenna, the imperial capital. There, he confronted the boy emperor. But there was no battle, no siege, no last stand. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West, was forced to abdicate. Odoacer spared his life, perhaps out of pity, perhaps because the gesture was enough. The imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter, were sent east to Constantinople, as if to say, the West no longer needs an emperor. 476 AD Odoacer, a barbarian warlord, demands his resignation. The end came not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet knock at the gates of Ravenna. Odoacer, commander of the barbarian federates, Heruli, Siri, Rugians, had risen not through noble lineage or senatorial favor, but through the loyalty of soldiers who had grown tired of broken promises. They had fought for Rome, bled for Rome, and now demanded what Rome could no longer give: land, security, recognition. When Orestes, the father of the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus, refused their demands, Odoacer acted. He crushed Orestes' forces, executed him, and marched on the imperial capital. There was no resistance. Ravenna, once a bastion of imperial authority, opened its gates. Inside, the last emperor of the West, a child no older than 14, waited. Romulus Augustulus had not ruled, he had merely worn the purple. He had no army, no allies, no hope. Odoacer entered not as a conqueror, but as a man fulfilling a grim necessity. He did not kill the boy. He did not parade him through the streets. He simply asked for his resignation. And Romulus gave it. There was no final speech, no defiant stand, no last decree from the Senate. The imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter, were gathered and sent east to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The message was clear: the West no longer needed an emperor. Odoacer would rule Italy not as Caesar, but as Rex, king. He would govern in the name of the Eastern Emperor, but in truth, he answered to no one, no battle, no speeches, just a signature and silence. There was no last stand in the Forum, no rallying cry from the Palatine Hill, no legions marched to defend the purple, no senators rose to protest. The end of the Western Roman Empire came not with the thunder of war, but with the quiet rustle of parchment. In a dim chamber in Ravenna, under the watchful eyes of Odoacer's envoys, the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus took up a pen. He signed away the throne he had never truly held. There was no resistance, no ceremony. Just a child, a signature, and the end of a world. The imperial regalia, symbols of centuries of dominion, were gathered and sent eastward, across the Adriatic, to Constantinople. There, They were presented to Emperor Zeno, not as trophies of conquest, but as relics of a fallen order. The message was clear. The West no longer required an emperor. Italy would be ruled by Odoacer, not as a usurper, but as a patrician in Zeno's name. It was a fiction, but one that suited both sides. The East could claim continuity. The West could fade with dignity. There were no riots in the streets, no mourning crowds. The people of Rome had seen too much: plague, famine, sack, betrayal. The fall of an emperor was no longer a shock. It was a formality, a final, quiet breath after a long, wheezing decline. The empire ends not with a fight, but a letter. A parchment sealed, a crown set aside, a child emperor fading into obscurity. The Western Roman Empire, which had once thundered across continents, now passed into history with the quiet formality of a resignation. No triumphal arch marked its end. No funeral procession mourned its passing. The regalia sent to Constantinople were not symbols of continuity. They were relics, acknowledgements that the West had no more emperors to crown. The Senate, once the voice of the Republic, offered no resistance. The people, long accustomed to disappointment, barely noticed. The empire had not been conquered. It had simply ceased to be. And yet, something remained. In the vacuum left by emperors and legions, another power stirred. One not forged by steel, but by spirit. The Church, once persecuted in catacombs and arenas, now stood tall in basilicas and councils. Its bishops had outlasted generals. Its scriptures had survived the sack. While Rome's political authority crumbled, its spiritual authority began to rise. The Pope, once just the Bishop of Rome, emerged as a figure of unity in a fractured world. The Church offered what the Empire no longer could order: purpose, hope. The Church rises. As emperors fell and provinces slipped away, the Church endured. In the ruins of empire, it became the one institution that still spoke with authority, still offered structure, still promised meaning. Bishops stepped into the vacuum left by fleeing governors. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and order. The Pope in Rome, once a spiritual figure among many, now emerged as a moral compass for a disoriented West. While the imperial court in Ravenna crumbled, the Church in Rome stood firm, its basilicas filled with the poor, the frightened, the faithful. Christianity, once persecuted in the shadows of the Colosseum, now lit candles in its chapels. The Church preserved Latin when the Senate no longer spoke it. It copied manuscripts when libraries burned. It fed the hungry when the grain ships stopped coming. And it offered a vision, not of empire, but of eternity. In sermons and scriptures, the faithful were reminded that Rome the city might fall, but the civitas die, the city of God, would endure. The Church did not just survive the fall of Rome, it redefined what it meant to be Roman. And while the West fractured into kingdoms and chaos, the East held on. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantines continue. While the West crumbled into fragments, the East endured, centered in Constantinople, once Byzantium, now the new Rome. The Eastern Roman Empire weathered the storms that shattered its Western twin. It had wealth, walls, and wisdom. Its capital straddled continents, guarded by sea and stone, and pulsed with trade from the Silk Road to the Black Sea. The emperors of the East still wore the purple, still issued laws in Latin, and, though Greek soon became the language of court and scripture, and still called themselves Romans. To them, the empire had not fallen. It had simply shifted. Under Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantines reclaimed parts of the Old West, Italy, North Africa, even parts of Spain. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, marched under Roman standards. His legal scholars compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of Roman law that would echo through centuries. His architects raised the Hagia Sophia, a dome that seemed to float between heaven and earth. The Byzantines preserved Roman governance, Roman engineering, Roman diplomacy, but they also transformed it. They became something new: a Christian empire, a Greek-speaking court, a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world. And though the Western Empire was gone, its fingerprints remained. Roman roads, laws, words, ghosts that linger. Though the Western Empire had collapsed, its bones remained scattered across the world it once ruled. The roads, straight, enduring, impossibly ambitious, still stitched together the landscape of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Soldiers no longer marched along them in imperial columns, but merchants, pilgrims, and peasants still followed their paths. Some were paved over by modern highways. Others lay quiet beneath fields and forests, their stones worn smooth by centuries of forgotten footsteps. Roman law, too, endured. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled in the East under Justinian, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. Concepts like contracts, property rights, and citizenship outlived the emperors who first proclaimed them. Even in the chaos of post-imperial kingdoms, Roman legal thought whispered through courtrooms and charters, and the words, Latin, the language of empire, never truly died. It evolved, fractured, and blossomed into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. In monasteries and universities, Latin remained the language of learning, of scripture, of diplomacy. The church spoke it. Scholars wrote in it. Even as new tongues rose, Latin lingered like incense in a cathedral. Faint, sacred, persistent. Rome had fallen, yes, but its shadow stretched long across the centuries. Its culture, its systems, its memory, these did not vanish. They haunted the world that came after, shaping it in ways both visible and invisible. A fall didn't kill Rome. It just made her mortal. It stripped away the illusion of eternity, revealing the city not as a divine constant, but as a place, stone and dust, memory and myth. Rome had once claimed dominion over time itself, measuring the world in its calendars, its roads, its laws. But now, time moved on without her. The emperors were gone. The legions disbanded. The Senate a whisper. Yet the city still stood, breathing in the silence between what was and what would never be again. Pilgrims still came, tracing the footsteps of saints and Caesars. Merchants still bartered in the shadow of broken arches. Children played where triumphs once marched. But the grandeur had faded. The marble was chipped. The gold leaf had flaked away. Rome was no longer the axis of the world. It was a relic, revered but no longer feared. A city of ghosts, where every column cast the shadow of a vanished empire. And in the Forum, the heart of old Rome, where Cicero once thundered and Caesar once bled, the stones lay cracked and uneven. The statues had toppled. The temples stood roofless. The voices were gone. Weeds grow in the Forum. Once the heart of Roman public life, the Forum now lay quiet, its stones cracked, its columns leaning, its triumphal arches casting long shadows over emptiness. Where once senators debated and generals paraded, now only the wind moved freely. Grass pushed through the paving stones. Ivy crept up the bases of forgotten statues. The marble that had echoed with the voices of Cicero and Caesar now bore only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional footfall of a wandering monk or scavenger. The great temples, Saturn, Vesta, Castor and Pollux, stood roofless, their gods long silent. The rostra, once a platform for oratory, was now a perch for birds. The Forum had become a garden of ghosts, where nature reclaimed what empire had built. And just beyond, the Colosseum loomed, its arches still proud, its bones still intact. But even there, the silence was deceptive. The crowds were gone, the emperors dead, but life had returned in a different form. No longer a stage for gladiators or imperial spectacle. The arena had become a den for the wild animals in the Colosseum. Once the stage for imperial spectacle, the Colosseum had become a hollow shell of its former self. In its prime, it had echoed with the roars of lions, the clash of steel, the cries of gladiators, and the cheers of 50,000 Roman citizens. Exotic beasts, lions from Numidia, elephants from Carthage, crocodiles from the Nile, had been paraded and slaughtered in elaborate hunts called venations, staged to display Rome's dominion over nature and the world. The arena floor had once been a canvas of blood and sand, where emperors demonstrated their power through orchestrated violence. But now, centuries later, the crowds were gone. The emperors were dust, and the beasts had returned, not as performers, but as squatters. Wolves prowled the lower corridors. Foxes nested in the collapsed seating. Birds of prey circled the upper tiers, perching on broken cornices. The Colosseum, once a monument to human mastery, had become a refuge for the wild. Nature crept back through the cracks in the stone, reclaiming what had been taken. Ivy curled around the arches. Most softened the blood-stained stones. The amphitheatre no longer echoed with spectacle. It whispered with wind and wings. And as the animals made their dens in the ruins, the people outside scavenged what remained. Broken columns and marble looted for peasant homes. The grandeur of Rome did not vanish in fire. It was dismantled, stone by stone, by the hands of those who had once lived in its shadow. As the empire faded and the city's wealth evaporated, the people who remained turned to the ruins not as monuments, but as quarries. The great temples, once clad in gleaming marble, were stripped bare. Columns that had held up the roofs of gods were toppled and carted away. The Forum, the Palatine, even the Colosseum, all became sources of building material for a new, humbler Rome. Peasants and artisans scavenged the city's bones. Marble was broken down and repurposed into doorsteps, hearths, and foundations. Bronze clamps were pried from ancient masonry and melted for tools. Statues were ground into lime for mortar. The very fabric of the empire was recycled into cottages and stables. The villas of senators became barns. The baths became sheepfolds. The aqueducts, once marvels of engineering, were cannibalized to build walls against bandits and wolves. Yet even as the city was stripped of its splendor, its memory endured. Travelers still came, not to see the empire and its glory, but to witness its fall. They walked among the ruins in silence, touching the stones as if they might still hold echoes of Cicero's voice or Caesar's footsteps. The broken temples became shrines. The shattered statues relics. The city, though fallen, had become sacred in its decay. Pilgrims arrived to touch ruins like bones of saints. They come not for spectacle, but for reverence. From distant lands and crumbling villages, they walk dusty roads to reach the fallen heart of empire. They pass under arches that no longer lead to triumph, kneel before columns that no longer hold roofs, and press their hands to stones worn smooth by centuries of grief and awe. To them, Rome is not just a city, it is a relic, a sacred corpse, the bones of a once living god. They whisper prayers in the shadow of the Pantheon. They light candles in the hollows of broken temples. They gather dust from the Forum as if it were holy ash. The ruins are not empty. They are charged with memory. Every crack in the marble, every vine creeping through the stone, is a testament to what was. And in that decay, they find something eternal. Not the empire, but the echo of its soul. They do not come to mourn. They come to remember, to feel the weight of time, to stand where emperors once stood and know that even the greatest fall. And yet, in falling, they become legend. Centuries later, men still whisper about her, not just historians or poets, but pilgrims, painters, and princes. They speak her name in candlelit studies and echo it in vaulted cathedrals. Rome, the fallen empress, the eternal city, lingers in the imagination like a half-remembered dream. Her ruins become scripture, her myths gospel. To walk her broken streets is to feel the breath of antiquity on your neck. Even in decay, she commands reverence. Even in silence, she speaks. Medieval monks copy her laws. Crusaders march under her standards. Emperors in the north call themselves her heirs. Holy Roman, though neither holy, nor Roman, nor truly imperial. Her shadow stretches across the Alps, across the centuries. She is the ghost that haunts every throne, the standard by which all greatness is measured. And though her temples lie in ruin, her spirit is never buried. Then, in the 15th century, the whispers grow louder. In Florence, in Rome, in Venice, men begin to dig. Not just in the earth, but in the past. They unearth statues, scrolls, forgotten philosophies. They study Cicero, sketch the Pantheon, dream of domes and columns and symmetry. They call it Renaissita, rebirth, the Renaissance. And at its heart is a longing not just for knowledge, but for her, for Rome, for the world she once was. Renaissance dreamers trying to bring her back. They studied her ruins like scripture, measured her columns with reverence, and filled their notebooks with sketches of her broken beauty. To the artists and architects of the Renaissance, Rome was not just a memory, it was a blueprint. Brunelleschi looked to her domes, Alberti to her proportions. Michelangelo walked her ruins and saw not decay, but potential. They did not mourn her, they tried to resurrect her. In Florence, in Rome, in the courts of popes and princes, the Renaissance was not merely a rebirth of art, it was a resurrection of identity. Humanists scoured monasteries for lost texts, unearthing Cicero Livy and Lucretius. Sculptors carved marble with the same tools and ambition as Phidias and Praxiteles. Painters gave their saints the faces of Roman gods. Even the language of power shifted. Latin returned to law, to letters, to the lips of scholars who believed that to speak like Rome was to think like her. But no matter how faithfully they copied her forms, no matter how grand their domes, or how balanced their facades, they could not bring her back. Rome was not a style, she was a spirit. And though her body lay in ruins, her soul wandered the halls of every palace, every library, every chapel that dared to echo her name. She remains the ghost that haunts all of Europe. In every capital crowned with domes and spires, in every library lined with Latin texts, in every courtroom echoing with Roman law, she lingers. Not as a queen, but as a memory. Rome, the fallen empress, walks beside kings who claim her mantle, whispers in the ears of revolutionaries who invoke her republic, and stares from the eyes of statues carved in her image. Her ruins are studied, her language dissected, her symbols resurrected in flags, crests, and coins. She is the standard by which greatness is measured, the mirror in which Europe sees both its glory and its decay. In Paris, in Vienna, in London, architects raise arches and domes in her likeness. In Berlin and Moscow, emperors and ideologues alike claim her legacy. Even in the New World, across oceans she never knew, her name is etched into capitals and constitutions. She is everywhere, and yet nowhere. A ghost, not of vengeance, but of longing, a reminder of what was and what might be again. But ghosts fade, not always in fire, but in silence, apathy, and forgetting. Empires do not always fall with a scream. Sometimes they fade with a sigh. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur and violence, did not vanish in a single blaze. It unraveled in the quiet moments, when senators stopped showing up, when roads went unrepaired, when laws were passed but no longer enforced. The people did not rise in revolt. They simply stopped believing. The rituals continued, but no one remembered why. The statues stood, but no one knew their names. The marble cracked, and no one cared enough to mend it. Apathy crept in like ivy through broken stone. The citizens, once proud of their civitas, now looked only to their fields, their families, their survival. The idea of Rome, of duty, of glory, of shared destiny, became a story told by old men to children who no longer listened. The empire was not slain by sword or siege alone. It was worn down by indifference. Forgotten by those it once fed, ignored by those it once ruled. The silence of the Forum was not imposed. It was chosen. And so, when people speak of Rome's fall, they picture flames, but the truth is quieter, more human, more tragic. Rome burned, yes, but mostly she decayed. The flames of Nero's Rome were real, but they were not the end. They were a chapter, not the closing line. The true death of the Western Empire came not in fire, but in the slow erosion of meaning, in the quiet abandonment of duty, in the fading of memory. The aqueducts still stood, but the water no longer flowed. The roads still stretched across the continent, but no legions marched. The laws still existed, but no one enforced them. Rome did not fall like a toppled statue. It crumbled like one left too long in the rain. And as the centuries passed, the line between Roman and not Roman blurred. A Frankish king wore a Roman title. A Gothic warlord ruled from a Roman palace. Latin prayers echoed in churches built from Roman stone. The empire had ended, but its shadow lingered, long, indistinct, and inescapable. Somewhere, perhaps in a crumbling villa or a quiet monastery, an old man lit a lamp, read a line of Virgil, and believed himself still Roman. He paid no heed to the shifting borders, the vanished emperors, the new kings with strange names. To him, Rome lived, in the language he spoke, the gods he had abandoned, the stories he still told. The last Roman may never have known he was. He may have been a monk, copying Virgil by candlelight in a crumbling monastery, or a farmer, still calling his land age a Romanus, unaware that the empire had long since vanished. Perhaps he was a soldier, wearing a rusted belt buckle stamped with SPQR, believing he still served something greater. He did not witness a fall. He lived a fading. And when he died, no trumpet sounded. No historian marked the moment. But with him, perhaps, passed the last breath of a world that had once called itself eternal. We've done our best to tell this story with care, drawing from the most reliable historical sources available. But history is vast, and even the ruins of Rome can whisper different truths. If we've made a mistake, it wasn't from lack of reverence. It was from the limits of what can be known. Now, let the echoes of empire fade. Let the marble rest. Let the dust settle on the Forum stones. You've walked through centuries tonight. You've stood in the shadow of emperors and saints, of ruins and rebirth. Close your eyes now. Let the eternal city sleep. And you, too, sleep well.